Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. We got some sunshine. We got some blue up above the roofs instead of grey and wet, which makes a nice change. It means my Oncidium sotoanum's stonking out the fragrance today. It hasn't been doing that lately. It's been quite quiet on the fragrance front anyway. Right, this is a quick video and I'm not going into huge amounts of detail, and it's more food for thought. And for those of you who don't like talking about nutrients, there's some music videos you should be watching. But when I showed my manky Rhychostylis gigantea, it raised a comment from Rick. And his comment was, that is crying out for some calcium. Twisted leaves, lack of root growth, lack of colour, you know, all those sorts of things. And it's like I said, when somebody with that level of experience on that particular subject speaks, I listen. And he recommended a good soak in CalMag for an afternoon or something at a level of sort of 100 parts per million, possibly as high as 140 parts per million, and really get some in there. Now, that basket is an awkward thing to soak because it needs quite deep water and quite a large surface area. The basket fits in there, but the plant won't let the basket go down to the bottom. And that holds 10 litres. So I haven't got enough spare water at the moment to do an immediate response, if you see what I mean. So what I thought I'd do is I'd have a go at the Vander bucket. And I thought I'll add some CalMag on top of what's already in there and raise the parts per million by 100 plus. Yeah, because it's still only going to take it up to about 250 because I'm feeding at lower levels. The Vanders, or the things that go in that bucket, aren't growing much this time of year. It's too cold for them, so they slow right down, so that's fair enough. And then I stopped and thought, and I got my MSU feed out, which is what's in that bucket, plus the CalMag at the moment, and I thought, let's add up the elements that constitute the fertiliser, and basically they add up to 42, and that's allowing one for all the little elements that sometimes are so small as to be almost unmeasurable, but they need to be there nonetheless. So if I mixed up my MSU fertiliser at 100 parts per million, only 42 parts per million is actually feed. The rest of it is whatever else they've put in there, packing, things that help things dissolve in water, pH balancers. There's various other things in there that don't constitute food. So out of 100 parts per million, I've got 42 parts per million that's feed. That's not a lot, is it? So let's twist that round a bit. Just as an example, the last food that my mount's got was 120 parts per million. Yeah? Well, out of that 120 parts per million, only 50 parts per million of that is actually feed. And then if you look at the percentage ratios of that feed, the calcium in that particular feed was 4 parts per million. You just as well go and have a pee in the ocean, quite honestly, for the amount of good that that's doing. So I'm going to have a rethink. I've always said with fertiliser, a little and often is probably better than overfeeding or putting levels of feed into your pots that's just going to hang around and not get used by the plant. So a little and often, the concept is sound. But how little? It's ever so difficult to find out genuine information about parts per million for types of orchids that vary through the different growing seasons and light levels. So finding out what you're supposed to do comes into the category of damn near impossible. So I think, generally speaking, I'm underfeeding. Now, there are plants at this time of year that are doing little or nothing because they're like warm growers and then they're in their sulky period. They're not growing much because they haven't got the temperatures during the day, although they might have some today, the sun's out, And certainly not the nighttime temperatures. I mean, literally for the last week or more, I've been down to the actual proverbial 12 degrees at night. But some plants are sulking. They don't like it. My Latoria dendrobiums, my Phalaenopsis type dendrobiums, my actual Phalaenopsis, apart from the Sedera japonica, that probably likes it. My resting dendrobiums are loving it. It's exactly what they want, and that's why I'm doing it. The Vandas won't be liking it. Not at all. So you have to appreciate that with lots of different genera in a single environment, they're not all going to be happy all of the time. Yeah? So, anyway, what I've done with that Vanda bucket, the feed level at that in there was at 140 parts per million. I bumped that up to 250 using CalMag. So, and that's reasonable stuff, I presume. I don't know how much packing and other stuff is in there. This is the bit that tends to be forgotten. It's like I've always said, if you get a fertiliser that says 20 20 20 and some other bits, 20 plus 20 plus 20 is 60. So 60% of what you're putting in your water is feed. The other 40% isn't. Yeah? Now if you get a fertiliser that says 10 10 10, the physical makeup, the balance, is exactly the same as 20 20 20, except for it's half as strong. But think about it. If 10 plus 10 plus 10 is 30, there's 70% of other stuff in there that you're paying for that is not much good at all. So yeah, I think just generally speaking, I'm underfeeding, but it is winter time. So I'm not going to go mad and stonk up my feed levels to ridiculous amounts. But talking to some of the other growers, I mean, you know, there's guys feeding at reasonably regular intervals, although they tend to flush a bit more often perhaps than I do because they're using higher levels of feed. But nearly all the experienced growers at the orchid societies always talk in micro-Siemens, which is a flipping nuisance because I don't. But there's a very easy conversion. And I mean, there's one guy there says, oh, I feed my Cattleyas at 600 microsiemens. So I had a quick look on the internet. There's a reasonable calculation. Parts per million is about 2/3 of a microsiemens value. So he's feeding his Cattleyas at 400 parts per million. I didn't ask what with, but you know, that would be his reading if he was using a normal TDS meter instead of one of the flashy expensive jobbies that does the microsiemens. You know, so I think generally speaking, I'm probably erring on the side of caution because I don't want salt build-up in the pots, but I think I'm generally underfeeding. But at this time of year, I'm certainly not altering things to any great extent. But we'll give that Rhychostylis a go. I've got to water my mounts now, so that's a separate entity, and that can sit in there till I'm good and ready to take it out. So that's going to get a good stock up with the CalMag basically, which was as instructed. Do as you're told, Roger. There are some people that can tell me to do stuff and I will do exactly as I'm told, and others I'll go away and look stuff up, or maybe just go, yeah, maybe. So we'll give that a go. I mean, my my Rhychoredes, there's too many Rhychos around at the moment, that goes in at the same time. There's a logic to that, because the Rhychoredes, if it goes in on its own, it turns over sideways and sinks and the whole plant goes in. Well, this time of year I don't want my whole plant getting soaking wet. If I put the basket in on its own, it sinks and the water level comes up into the crown of the plant. So I don't want to do that. But if I put them both in together, they sort of sit nicely. They hold each other up. So that's why they're both in there. The Vandas go in one at a time because they only just fit anyway. So yeah, just having a think. This business of parts per million is always a total reading. It's a total of everything that's gone in there without any ability whatsoever to know the breakdown. It's just a measurement of what's been dissolved in the water. It doesn't give you a clue what it is. It's just you can only really call it a rough guide. But you know, the difference between 100 parts per million, 200 parts and 300 parts and 400 parts is quite distinct. And even if your gauge isn't that accurate, it'll give you that sort of level of information, which is fine. You know, because under no circumstances can I ever imagine that for orchids you're going to need to measure precisely. Like, I need 147 parts per million today. No, you don't. You need somewhere around 150. That'll do. Doesn't need to be that accurate. Anyway, a few thoughts and some food for thought. I mean, there's lots of people using lots of different fertilisers. They'll all have an analysis on the side. But it's worth having a step back sometimes and sort of think, well, what does that analysis actually mean when I'm mixing it up with water and measuring it at its total level? Total parts per million. Total dissolved salts, as TDS stands for. Or as I call it, total dissolved stuff. Still starts with S, I like it like that. But yeah, some food for thought. You know, I suppose if you buy the individual chemical elements, like if I went out and bought calcium nitrate, I would imagine that in that packet would be calcium nitrate and nothing else. So if I mix that up at 100 parts per million, I probably would be getting 100 parts per million of calcium. But when you've got mixed up fertilisers, made up fertilisers with all the elements added in, there's always some packing in there that they don't give you the analysis of. They don't even tell you what it is. You know, so it's food for thought. Now I got watering to do while that thing soaks. And we'll see what happens. Quite honestly, from what I've read and from what I've heard, the things that are lacking that can show a result relatively quickly do include calcium. You can get quite quick results. I don't mean, you know, like this afternoon, that's going to be nice bright green with new roots growing. Don't be daft. But you know what I mean. There are some changes that just take an absolute age to show up, especially if your orchid's growing or hardly growing at all. You know, its movement is next to nothing. The time when you see the most benefit from chopping and changing things around, if you do that sort of thing, is when stuff's really actively growing, when you've got new growths pushing on with new root systems being generated. That's when you can see differences quicker. But calcium is one of those that does show up relatively quick. Now, whether those little twisted leaves can ever straighten themselves out because they're old, I doubt it. But, you know, it should, if it has an effect, they should green up a bit. That can definitely happen on the older stuff. And in addition to that, if it starts getting a level of content, as far as nutrients are concerned, that it's happier with, it should start growing better, and it should start some new roots out of the bottom. Because I think I've only got 2 new roots this year. Now, okay, they're great big thick fleshy things, but you know, its activity has been minimal the whole of this year. And that's one that would have enjoyed the heat. It's a warm grower. But if it was lacking in its feed level, it isn't going to grow. You see what I mean? Underfeeding can just cause a plant to remain static. It's got nothing to work with, or not enough to work with. So anyway, food for thought. Now, I got watering to do. What was it? Oh, I'll do it later. I'm sure there was a new bloom somewhere lurking. I can't see it now. One bit of good news, I've got 2 Paphiopedilum buds pushing out. Well, they're breaking the surface of the crown, shall we say. They haven't exactly got a stalk with a bud sticking out yet, but 2 of them are going to bloom anyway. So we'll see how we get on. But yeah, it's just food for thought. I mean, I don't mind standing back and being corrected, but if my analysis of my MSU feed is correct, out of 100% of it, only 42%-ish is genuine nutrients, and the rest isn't. So as a consequence of that, When I'm using a TDS meter and using parts per million, should I be thinking, right, I've got 200 parts per million. Now hang on, only 80 parts per million is actually feed. You see what I'm getting at? Right, I've got 400 parts per million, but only 160 parts per million is feed. But I would like to know what that other stuff is. And at excess levels, can it do any harm? They won't tell you what it is. Anyway, food for thought. Have fun. I can supply a really cheap bulk packet of aspirins for those who need them. I don't, because I don't find it comical, but I do find it interesting enough to bother. And I giggle with it. I don't take it so seriously that I'm going to lose sleep. Let's put it that way. See you next time.